Imagine walking down the street today and witnessing something utterly unthinkable, a ritual so bizarre, so unsettling, that it would send shivers down your spine. Now picture this. What if I told you that very same practice was once as ordinary as brushing your teeth or checking your phone? History is full of moments that would leave us horrified today, yet were completely normal, even celebrated in their time. From blood-soaked ceremonies to rituals that defy modern morality, the past is a treasure chest of forbidden acts that have been buried by time, and today we're cracking it wide open. This isn't just a glimpse into the past, it's a journey into the shadows of human behavior, where the line between sacred and savage blurs. These were not the actions of monsters, but of everyday people living in worlds governed by beliefs we can scarcely comprehend. Some of these practices were born from desperation, others from devotion, and a few from sheer, unthinkable cruelty. But all of them share one chilling thread. They were once accepted, even expected, as part of daily life. How could something so shocking ever be considered normal? That's the question we'll unravel as we explore 25 forbidden ancient practices that were once common. You might think you know the darker corners of history, but brace yourself. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you assume about the past. These aren't just obscure footnotes, they're stark reminders of how fluid morality can be across centuries. Some will make your skin crawl, others will leave you baffled, and a few might even make you question what future generations will condemn about our own era. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to step into a world where the unthinkable was routine. Because by the time we're done, you'll never look at history or humanity the same way again. Imagine standing at the base of a towering Aztec temple, the air thick with the scent of burning incense and something far more metallic, blood. At the summit, a priest raises an obsidian blade high, its edge glinting in the sun before plunging it into the chest of a living, breathing person. This wasn't some nightmare, it was a sacred duty as routine as a Sunday service. Among the Aztecs and Maya, human sacrifice wasn't just accepted, it was essential to the very order of the universe. The scale was staggering. In a single ceremony in 1487, historians believe the Aztecs sacrificed over 80,000 prisoners of war to dedicate the great temple of Tenochtitlan. The methods were horrifyingly precise. The most common ritual, heart extraction. Victims were held down on a stone altar while a priest carved open their ribcage with a razor-sharp blade, tearing out the still beating heart to offer to the gods. Some victims were even made to climb the temple steps themselves, believing they'd become divine messengers in death. But why, to modern eyes, it seems like senseless brutality. To them, it was survival. The Aztecs believed the sun god Huitzilopochtli needed human blood to wage his eternal battle against darkness. No sacrifices meant no sunrise. No dawn, the end of everything. The Maya shared similar beliefs, offering royal bloodletting rituals where kings and queens pierced their own tongues or genitals to feed the gods. Archaeology confirms these accounts in chilling detail. At the Templo Maya in Mexico City, excavations revealed racks of human skulls, some numbering in the thousands, mounted on wooden posts as grim trophies. Stone carvings show gods clutching human hearts, their mouths open in eternal hunger. Even children weren't spared. Mass graves of infants suggest offerings to Tlaloc, the rain god, during droughts. What's truly unsettling isn't just the violence, it's how ordinary it was. Imagine a culture where parents brought children to witness these spectacles like we'd take them to a parade. Where poets wrote hymns praising the precious dew of sacrificial blood. This wasn't the work of a few fanatics, it was civilization itself, humming along to a rhythm we can barely comprehend. And that's the real horror, realizing how thin the line is between sacred and savage when survival hangs in the balance. Blood wasn't just spilled in Mesoamerican rituals, it was the life force of the universe itself. To the Aztecs and Maya, every drop carried divine power, a sacred currency that kept the cosmos from collapsing. Think of it like an ancient cosmic contract. Humans fed the gods with their blood, and in return, the gods maintained the world. Without this exchange, the sun would stall, crops would fail, and time itself would unravel. The tools they used for bloodletting were as precise as they were terrifying. Obsidian blades, sharper than modern surgical steel, were favored for their ability to make clean, controlled cuts. Stingray spines, with their natural serrated edges, were another common tool, especially among Maya royalty, who would pierce their own tongues or genitals, threading ropes of thorns through the wounds to maximize blood flow. These weren't acts of pain for pain's sake. They were profound demonstrations of piety, a ruler's way of proving their worthiness to commune with the gods. One of the most striking rituals was the Maya vision quest, where nobles would bleed themselves into a trance-like state, their blood dripping onto strips of bark paper. As the crimson pooled, they'd burn it, believing the smoke carried their offering straight to the spirit world. Sometimes they'd even hallucinate from blood loss, interpreting these visions as divine messages. Archaeologists have found ceremonial bowls with traces of royal blood, still stained after centuries, proof of how deeply these acts were woven into the fabric of power and faith. But here's what's truly mind-bending. For the Aztecs, even the act of dying in battle was sacred. Warriors who fell in combat or were sacrificed were said to join the sun god in the sky, returning as hummingbirds after 4 years. It's a hauntingly beautiful belief, one that transformed death into something almost desirable. This wasn't mindless violence, it was a complex, deeply spiritual economy of suffering and renewal. And it forces us to ask, what rituals do we practice today that might seem just as shocking to future generations? In the scorching sands of ancient Egypt, death wasn't just an end, it was a doorway. And it wasn't just humans who received a ticket to eternity. Beneath the pyramids and hidden in labyrinthine tombs, archaeologists have uncovered millions of mummified animals, from tiny shrews to towering crocodiles, each carefully preserved as sacred offerings. This wasn't a niche practice, it was an industry, a spiritual fervor so vast that entire temples became factories for the dead. Take the catacombs of Saqqara, where darkened corridors stretch for miles, their walls lined with stacked mummies of ibises, hawks, and baboons, all wrapped in linen and sealed with resin. At the cult center of Bubastes, devotees of the cat goddess Bastet left so many feline mummies that 19th century excavators shipped them by the ton to England, where they were ground into fertilizer. The numbers defy belief. One single tomb complex held nearly 8 million dog mummies, another 4 million ibis birds. These weren't casual gestures, they were acts of devotion on an almost unimaginable scale. The process itself was as meticulous as it was macabre. A pet cat destined for mummification would be fed a last meal of fish, then euthanized, sometimes with a swift neck break to preserve its posture. Priests would remove its organs through small incisions, pack the body with natron salt to desiccate it, then wrap it in strips of linen arranged to mimic the folds of living fur. Some were even given tiny wooden or bronze coffins, their lids painted with wide, golden eyes to guide them through the underworld. Crocodiles, symbols of the god Sobek, received the same royal treatment, their gaping jaws bound shut with rope, their bodies stuffed with reeds to maintain their fearsome shape. But here's the twist, not all these mummies contained actual animals. X-rays reveal some are just bundles of rags or random bones, ancient forgeries sold to pilgrims who couldn't afford the real thing. Think of it like buying a counterfeit relic at a medieval shrine. The intention mattered more than the contents. What drove this obsession? For Egyptians, animals were living avatars of the gods. A cat wasn't just a pet, it carried the essence of Bastet. A falcon was Horus in feathery form. By sending these creatures into the afterlife with care, believers ensured the gods' favor, protection for their families, blessings for their crops, a safe passage for their own souls. Yet there's something haunting in the way these mummies blur the line between devotion and desperation. Imagine a parent purchasing a mummified puppy to bury with their child, hoping Anubis would guide them both. Or a farmer sacrificing his best hunting dog, trusting that its spirit would intercede for him in the halls of Osiris. These weren't just rituals, they were acts of love, fear, and hope preserved in linen and time. And it forces us to wonder, what do we cling to today with the same fervor? What modern obsessions might future archaeologists uncover and puzzle over, shaking their heads at what we once believed was sacred? In the flickering torchlight of an Egyptian temple, a single act could mean life or death, not for a person but for a cat. These weren't just pets, they were living extensions of the goddess Bastet, her divine presence walking among humans on delicate paws. To harm one was to invite calamity. Ancient texts describe punishments so severe they'd make a modern animal lover shudder. If someone even accidentally killed a cat, the penalty was execution. No trials, no appeals, just swift, brutal justice. The depth of this reverence becomes chillingly clear in one infamous incident recorded by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus. In 60 BCE, a Roman merchant's wagon accidentally ran over an Egyptian cat. It didn't matter that he was a foreigner, that it was an accident, or that he begged for mercy. The locals dragged him from his cart and beat him to death on the spot. When King Ptolemy XII tried to intervene fearing diplomatic fallout, the mob refused to back down. Their fury wasn't just anger, it was terror. They believed harming a cat would bring Bastet's wrath upon the entire community, cursing crops, drying up the Nile, and inviting chaos into their carefully ordered world. But why cats? To Egyptians, they embodied the perfect balance of grace and ferocity, qualities mirrored in Bastet herself. By day, she was a gentle protector of homes and mothers. By night, she transformed into a lioness, her claws bared against chaos. Cats kept homes free of snakes and vermin, their quiet vigilance seen as a divine gift. Killing one wasn't just a crime against an animal, it was an assault on the cosmic order. Archaeologists have found entire cemeteries dedicated to feline mummies, some wearing delicate bronze or beaded collars. At the temple of Bastet in Bubastes, pilgrims would bring mummified cats as offerings, stacking them like sacred bricks in the walls. The goddess's festival was one of the most raucous in Egypt. Herodotus describes rivers of wine, dancing in the streets, and a sea of rattling sistrums as thousands celebrated their feline protector. Yet there's a haunting irony here. While Egyptians mourned each cat as a divine being, they also bred them by the thousands specifically for mummification. Kitten farms operated near temples, churning out sacred offerings destined for early deaths. It's a paradox that lingers: unconditional love for an animal, wrapped in the calculated machinery of faith. This wasn't just ancient Egypt's quirk. Across cultures, animals have been both sacrificed and sanctified, their bodies caught between reverence and ritual. What does that tell us about humanity? Perhaps that our deepest devotions are never simple, they're tangled in fear, love, and the desperate hope that something greater than ourselves is listening. And maybe, just maybe, that purring shadow curling around your ankles carries more mystery than we dare admit. The roar of the crowd shakes the very foundations of the Colosseum as two men circle each other in the dust. One grips a short sword, the other a trident and net, both breathing heavily, both knowing only one will walk out alive. This wasn't just sport to the Romans, it was spectacle, politics, and even religion rolled into one blood-soaked afternoon. Gladiatorial combat wasn't some fringe entertainment. It was the empire's beating heart, a ritual where life and death danced together under the watchful eyes of 50,000 screaming citizens. The journey to the arena began in the ludus training schools that turned slaves, prisoners, and even volunteers into lethal performers. Think of them as ancient cross between boot camps and theater troops. New recruits endured brutal conditioning, mastering weapons like the gladius, the curved scissor blade, or the racharius's net. The best fighters became celebrities, their names scrawled on walls like modern-day sports stars. Take Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator who led a slave revolt so massive it nearly toppled Rome itself. Or Flamma, the Syrian warrior who won his freedom 4 times only to choose the arena again and again. But the games weren't just about individual glory. Emperors like Nero and Commodus weaponized them, staging elaborate battles to distract citizens from corruption or famine. A single event could last months, featuring not just gladiators but exotic animal hunts with lions, elephants, even giraffes hauled from Africa. The Colosseum's hypogeum, a labyrinth of underground tunnels, allowed tigers to burst from trapdoors, chariots to rise through the floor, and entire naval battles to flood the arena. One record describes 9,000 beasts slaughtered in 100 days. What's most unsettling isn't the violence, it's the normalization. Families brought picnic lunches to watch men die. Betting tables buzzed with wagers on how long a combatant would last. Poets wrote verses comparing the spray of blood to spring rain. And when a gladiator fell, the crowd didn't just passively watch, they voted with thumbs up or down, deciding if he'd earned mercy or a final stab through the throat. Yet even here, there were moments of unexpected humanity. Some gladiators formed bonds, refusing to kill injured comrades. Graffiti in Pompeii shows 2 fighters labeled the Unbeaten and the Heartthrob, proof they had fans rooting for them. And the rare victor who survived years in the arena could retire wealthy, his scars worn like medals. This was Rome's dark mirror, a society that built aqueducts and laws but also cheered as men became living sacrifices to entertainment. It forces us to ask, what brutal pastimes do we embrace today, convinced they're harmless, and what will future generations condemn about our own arenas, real or virtual? The sands of the Colosseum may be silent now, but their echoes still whisper warnings across the centuries. Even the most legendary gladiators knew a hard truth: no amount of applause could wipe away their slave brands. Take the case of Priscus and Verus, 2 fighters whose epic duel was immortalized by the poet Martial. After an hour of brutal combat that left the Colosseum shaking with cheers, both men collapsed simultaneously. Emperor Titus, moved by their skill, granted them the rudes, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom, a rare honor handed to fewer than 1 in 100 gladiators. But what did freedom really mean for men who'd spent years killing for others' amusement? The rudes came with strings attached. Former gladiators often became trainers in the same ludus they'd bled in, coaching new recruits in the arts that had nearly killed them. Some, like Flamma, chose to return to the sand despite earning their freedom, perhaps because the adrenaline of battle had rewired their minds. Modern psychologists might recognize the symptoms: the hollow emptiness outside the arena, the inability to connect with civilians, the addiction to the roar of the crowd. These men weren't just athletes, they were trauma survivors navigating a world that revered their scars but still whispered "slave" behind their backs. And then there were those who never made it to freedom. The crowd's thumb gestures, often misrepresented as simple up or down votes, were far more complex. A thumb pressed flat against the throat meant death. A thumb tucked into a closed fist might signal mercy, but these decisions weren't about fairness, they were about spectacle. A wounded gladiator who'd fought poorly would be dispatched quickly. One who'd shown extraordinary courage might be spared, not out of compassion, but because the audience wanted an encore. The psychological toll extended beyond the fighters. In Pompeii's graffiti, we find heartbreaking notes from gladiator groupies, women who fell for men they knew might not survive the week. One scrawled message reads, "Crescens, the net fighter, catches girls in his nets at night. Beneath the bravado lies a terrible tension. Every night together could be their last." This was the grim contract of the arena. Fight well, and you might earn not just your life but adoration to rival modern celebrities. Fight poorly, and you'd be dragged through the gate of death, your corpse dumped like spoiled meat. Yet some kept climbing back into the sand, lured by the same thing that repels us today, the intoxicating, dehumanizing thrill of being both worshipped and expendable. The silk slippers were tiny, no longer than a child's hand, and inside them lay a secret agony. For 1,000 years in China, the perfect foot wasn't just dainty, it was broken. The practice of foot binding began innocently enough, with noble women in the Tang dynasty wrapping their feet to mimic a favored concubine's delicate dance. But by the Song dynasty, it had spiraled into something far more grotesque. Girls as young as 5 or 6 would have their toes snapped backward and bound tightly against the sole, the arch forcibly fractured until the entire foot could be folded in half like a crescent moon. The ideal length, 3 inches, they called it the golden lily. Historical records paint a picture of almost unimaginable suffering. One 19th century woman recalled her binding in haunting detail. The pain was so intense it felt like my feet were being sawed off. At night, I'd soak my bedding with tears, but my mother would just tighten the bandages, telling me beauty required sacrifice. The process took years. Bandages were reapplied daily, often cutting off circulation until toes rotted and fell away. Infections were common, and some girls died from sepsis. Those who survived faced a lifetime of agony, hobbling on feet that had essentially become stumps wrapped in silk. Walking any distance was torture, running impossible. Yet this wasn't some hidden barbarity, it was mainstream. A woman with unbound feet was seen as unmarriageable, her family disgraced. Poems compared bound feet to lotus blossoms, and erotic art fetishized the fragile gait it produced. Even practical considerations took a backseat to aesthetics. A Qing dynasty manual for brides explicitly stated, "If a woman's feet aren't bound, her voice is coarse and her steps vulgar." The irony, many of these women came from farming families, expected to work in crippling pain to uphold an impossible standard. The depth of societal pressure becomes chillingly clear in rare first-hand accounts. One elderly woman confessed decades later, "I hated it. I begged my grandmother to stop, but she said if I didn't endure, no man would feed me when I grew old." Another described secretly loosening her bandages at night, only to have her mother tie them tighter each morning with a warning, "Do you want to end up a beggar?" By the 19th century, an estimated 40 to 50% of Chinese women had bound feet, rising to nearly 100% among the upper classes. What's most unsettling isn't just the physical mutilation, it's how thoroughly the practice was internalized. Generations of women became its fiercest enforcers, perpetuating the cycle onto daughters and granddaughters. Even when the government banned foot binding in the early 20th century, some families continued in secret, convinced tradition outweighed the pain. Archaeology adds a visceral layer to these stories. Excavated shoes reveal how bones twisted over time, some fused into near-solid blocks. X-rays show toes crushed beneath metatarsals like shattered pottery. And then there are the hidden rebellions, embroidered slippers with thicker soles, suggesting some women tried to cushion their steps when no one was looking. This wasn't just about beauty, it was about control, a visible marker of female submission, proof that a woman could endure suffering silently for male approval. And it forces us to ask, what modern sacrifices do we demand in the name of attractiveness? What future generations will look back at our rituals with the same horrified fascination? The last surviving women with bound feet only passed away in the 21st century, their twisted souls a living bridge to a past that feels both distant and uncomfortably close. By the 19th century, bound feet had become more than just a beauty standard, they were a social passport. A woman's tiny feet signaled her family's wealth, proving she didn't need to labor in fields or markets. This wasn't just about marriage prospects, it was about survival in a rigid hierarchy. Peasants who couldn't afford to lose their daughters' labor sometimes bound feet loosely, allowing minimal mobility while still appearing refined. But for the elite, the most extreme deformities became bragging rights. At high society gatherings, women would compete to slip their feet into ever smaller slippers, some even crafting shoes so tiny they could only be worn by balancing on the toes like a ballerina endpoint. Resistance did exist, though often in whispers. Folk songs from rural regions mocked the practice, with one lyric joking, "A bride with golden lilies trips on her wedding day. Her husband grabs her waist only to find she's hollow as a reed." Some Taoist sects condemned foot binding as a violation of the body's natural form, while early feminists like Q Jin publicly unbound their feet, calling it chains around women's souls. But the most surprising pushback came from an unexpected quarter, the Qing dynasty's Manchurian rulers, who saw foot binding as a Han Chinese custom threatening their authority. Multiple emperors issued bans, with one decree in 1664 threatening to execute fathers who bound their daughters' feet. Yet the tradition persisted, woven too deeply into the fabric of identity to be undone by laws alone. The real death knell came from outside. 19th century Western missionaries recoiled at the practice, photographing unwrapped feet to shock audiences back home. These images became propaganda, fueling the colonial narrative of China as a barbaric nation in need of civilizing. Ironically, it was this imperialist scorn that finally galvanized Chinese reformers. By the early 20th century, anti-foot-binding societies sprang up, their rallies featuring piles of discarded bandages set ablaze. The last major ban came in 1949 under Mao Zedong, with inspectors literally measuring women's feet in public squares. Those caught binding faced steep fines or even forced unbandaging, a brutal irony, given that years of binding made the process of freeing the feet excruciating. Modern parallels are uncomfortably close. Think of corset training that reshapes ribs, or extreme plastic surgeries like rib removals for a narrower waist. Social media influencers today showcase waist trainers that squeeze organs unnaturally, while high heels, though less drastic, still prioritize aesthetics over comfort, altering posture and causing long-term damage. Even the language echoes the past. Phrases like "beauty is pain" or "no pain, no gain" reinforce the idea that suffering is a prerequisite for acceptance. But here's the crucial difference. Where foot binding was enforced by survival, today's extremes are often framed as choices. Yet how free is that choice when society rewards conformity with likes, followers, and social capital? The line between tradition and coercion blurs when the stakes are invisibility versus validation. The last living women with bound feet left behind a haunting lesson. When pain is packaged as privilege, it's hard to see the chains until someone points out the lock. The victim's screams would have been swallowed by the cold Norse wind as the knife traced its first incision along his spine. According to the sagas, the Blood Eagle was no mere execution. It was a ritual of vengeance so brutal, so meticulously cruel, that even seasoned warriors spoke of it in hushed tones. The process was as methodical as it was horrific. The victim was placed face down, their ribs hacked from the spine and pried outward like wings, their lungs pulled through the gaps to flutter against their back like a grisly pair of crimson sails. Salt might be sprinkled into the wounds to prolong the agony, all while the executioner recited odes to Odin, the god of war and wisdom who allegedly demanded such sacrifices. But how much of this was real and how much was Viking propaganda? The saga's epic poems like the Orkneyinga Saga and Saga of the Sons of Ragnar Lothbrok describe the Blood Eagle in vivid detail. One account claims the legendary Ivar the Boneless performed it on King Aelle of Northumbria in 867 as payback for murdering his father Ragnar. Yet historians have long debated whether these descriptions were literal or metaphorical, a way to emphasize the Vikings' fearsome reputation. After all, terror was currency in the medieval world, and nothing discouraged rebellion like tales of a punishment worse than death itself. Recent archaeology has added fuel to the debate. In 2022, researchers re-examined skeletal remains from a 10th century mass grave in Dorset, England, a site linked to Viking raids. One male skeleton showed unusual cut marks along the ribs, consistent with the precise blade work described in the sagas. But here's the twist: forensic analysis suggested the victim was already dead when the cuts were made. This finding splits the scholarly community. Some argue it proves the Blood Eagle was post-mortem theater, a symbolic mutilation rather than a living torture. Others counter that Viking chroniclers, writing centuries later, may have exaggerated surviving oral traditions into something more grotesque. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Ritualized violence was undeniably part of Norse culture. Their legal system included punishments like the Bloody Eagle, a lesser-known but documented penalty where an outlaw's back was carved with an eagle symbol. And Viking spirituality often blurred the lines between brutality and sacrament. Sacrifices to Odin sometimes involved hanging victims from trees or impaling them on spears, practices meant to mimic the god's own suffering for wisdom. The Blood Eagle, if real, might have been the ultimate offering, a human body transformed into a sacred artifact, its pain an echo of divine sacrifice. What's chilling isn't just the act itself, but how it challenges our assumptions about history's darkest corners. Were the Vikings uniquely savage, or were they simply better at weaponizing their reputation? After all, contemporary Christian rulers like King Ethelred the Unready ordered mass executions of Danes, including women and children, atrocities often glossed over in medieval chronicles. The Blood Eagle forces us to ask who gets to define brutality, and why some horrors become legend while others fade into footnotes. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Blood Eagle's power never relied on being real. Its terror lived in the telling, in the way a whisper of flayed ribs could make enemies surrender without a fight. In that sense, it worked perfectly because 9 centuries later we're still shuddering at the thought. And that's the real lesson of history's forbidden practices. Sometimes the stories we fear are more potent than the blades that carved them. The Vikings understood something modern warlords still exploit today: fear is a weapon sharper than any axe. While the Blood Eagle's historicity remains debated, its psychological impact is undeniable. Imagine you're an 8th century English villager hearing travelers whisper of a Norse warlord who turns men into blood eagles. Wouldn't you think twice before resisting when his longships appear on the horizon? This wasn't just punishment, it was psychological warfare designed to paralyze enemies before the first blow landed. The Romans perfected similar tactics. Crucifixion wasn't merely a death sentence, it was a public spectacle, a living billboard that proclaimed, "This is the price of defiance." Victims were often stripped naked, their agonized twitching visible for miles along major roads. The sheer duration of the suffering, sometimes days, maximized its deterrent effect. Unlike the Blood Eagle, crucifixion left no ambiguity. Thousands witnessed its horrors firsthand, yet both methods shared a core strategy: transforming the victim's body into a message written in pain for all to read. The Aztecs took this concept even further with flaying rituals. After sacrificing enemy warriors, priests would sometimes wear their skins for days, dancing in the flayed flesh like grotesque puppets. The underlying message was cosmic as much as it was territorial. Your gods failed to protect you, now your very skin serves our deities. Spanish conquistadors described temples hung with cured human hides, some still wearing the victim's hair or fingernails. Like the Vikings, the Aztecs weaponized the human form, reducing adversaries to mere props in their theological theater. What unites these practices across continents and eras is their calculated duality. They weren't just acts of violence, but performances with audiences in mind. The Romans crucified rebels where rebellion simmered. The Aztecs displayed flayed skins in full view of rival city-states. The Vikings ensured Blood Eagle tales spread through trade routes like dark folklore. Each culture tailored its brutality to strike at the psyche of specific enemies. Romans aimed to crush collective defiance, Aztecs to demonstrate divine favor, Vikings to seed paralyzing uncertainty. Modern parallels abound. Medieval kings mounted traitors' heads on city gates. Pirates flew the Jolly Roger not just to identify themselves but to trigger surrenders. Even today, terrorist groups broadcast executions to amplify fear globally. The tools have changed: social media instead of sagas, videos instead of flayed skins. But the principle remains: terror thrives when violence transcends the act itself and becomes a story too horrifying to ignore. Perhaps the most unsettling revelation is how ordinary people internalized these spectacles. Roman citizens brought children to watch crucifixions like we'd attend a play. Aztec commoners participated in skin-stretching rituals as acts of devotion. Norse skalds turned blood eagles into epic poetry. This normalization is where history holds up its darkest mirror, asking us which modern horrors we've learned to live with and what future generations will recoil at in our own era of curated violence. After all, the line between barbarism and justice has always been drawn by the victors and redrawn by those who come next. The wail of a newborn should signal joy, but on the slopes of Mount Tegitos it often meant a death sentence. Spartan elders didn't cradle their infants tenderly, they inspected them like livestock. Any child deemed weak, deformed, or too small was taken to the apotheke, the place of rejection, and left exposed to the elements. This wasn't neglect, it was policy, a cold calculation to strengthen the state. Plutarch recorded the chilling protocol. Newborns were bathed in wine instead of water, a test believed to provoke seizures in unfit babies. Those who survived the bath faced the elders' council, their tiny limbs scrutinized for perfection. Fail the inspection, and you'd be tossed into a chasm like damaged goods. Athens practiced its own version of this brutality, but with a sinister twist. While Sparta rejected infants for physical flaws, Athenian families often abandoned healthy baby girls simply for their gender. A surviving letter from one Athenian man to his wife reads like a grocery list. If it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, expose it. The reasoning was ruthlessly practical. Daughters required dowries, while sons could inherit property and continue the family line. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves of infants near Athens, their skeletal remains stacked in pots or pits with no markers, their short lives erased by a single crime, being born female in the wrong era. The contrasts between these two approaches reveal unsettling truths. Sparta's infanticide was collectivist, a sacrifice for the greater military good. Athens was economic, a household-level calculus of resources. Both societies rationalized the unthinkable, wrapping infanticide in legitimacy: Sparta through state mandate, Athens through social pressure. But neither acted alone. Across Greece, the practice was so common that playwrights like Sophocles referenced it casually in tragedies, and philosophers like Plato openly advocated for it in The Republic, arguing deformed children and those of inferior parents shouldn't be raised. Yet fragments of resistance glimmer in the historical record. Some Athenian families chose to raise daughters in secret, disguising them as boys until adolescence. Legal documents from Gortyn in Crete show penalties for stealing an exposed child, proof that some saw value in these cast-offs. And in Sparta, legends persist of rejected infants saved by helots, the enslaved lower class, who raised them in the shadow of the society that discarded them. The most haunting evidence comes from archaeology. In 2008, researchers excavating a well in Athens found the bones of over 450 infants mixed with animal remains, some showing signs of congenital disorders. At the base of Mount Tegitos, hikers still report finding ancient pottery shards, possible remnants of vessels that once carried unwanted babies to their fate. What chills isn't just the acts themselves, but how casually they were accepted. Spartan mothers allegedly told their sons to return from war with their shield or on it, dead rather than defeated. That same ethos extended to infancy: be perfect or be gone. Athens, birthplace of democracy and philosophy, quietly perpetuated gender-based murder while celebrating goddesses like Athena. This cognitive dissonance forces us to confront an ugly truth: that even the most civilized societies can normalize atrocities when ideology or economics demand it. And it begs a question we're still grappling with today: who decides which lives are worth living? Our modern debates about genetic screening or gender selection echo these ancient horrors, proving that the ethics of infancy have always been a mirror held up to humanity's darkest priorities. The mountain winds may have silenced those infant cries long ago, but their echoes linger in every society that's ever measured a child's worth by utility rather than humanity. The Spartan obsession with perfection wasn't unique. It echoed through the ancient world like a dark refrain. In Rome, the patriarch of every household held a power that would make modern parents shudder: the right of patria potestas, absolute authority over life and death. A father could legally execute a deformed child, a sickly infant, or even a grown son for disobedience, all under the guise of maintaining family honor. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, spelled it out plainly: a dreadfully deformed child shall be killed immediately. Unlike Sparta's state-mandated culling, Rome's version was a private affair, hidden behind villa walls and justified as a father's solemn duty. Yet even in this rigid system, glimmers of defiance flickered. The legend of Oedipus, though Greek, captures the irony of these policies. Abandoned as an infant due to a prophecy, he was saved by a shepherd and unknowingly returned to greatness, fulfilling the very fate his parents sought to avoid. Real-life parallels exist too. Roman writers like Seneca noted cases where enslaved wet nurses secretly rescued exposed infants, raising them as their own. And in Pompeii, archaeologists found the skeleton of a child with severe congenital defects buried lovingly in a family tomb, proof that not all imperfect lives were discarded. The justifications for these practices reveal a chilling pragmatism. Philosophers like Aristotle argued that eliminating the weak strengthened society, while physicians like Soranus offered guidelines for spotting deformities at birth. But what's seldom acknowledged is how these ideas laid groundwork for later atrocities. The 19th century eugenics movement borrowed heavily from Roman and Spartan ideals, repackaging ancient cruelty as scientific progress. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't why these societies practiced selective infanticide, but how they squared it with their values. Romans wept over plays about abandoned children while leaving their own in the wilderness. Spartans praised maternal devotion as mothers handed healthy babies to executioners. This cognitive dissonance forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity's capacity to love and destroy often coexists in the same breath, separated only by the shifting lines of culture and convenience. And here's the twist: these ancient survival of the fittest philosophies rarely achieved their goals. Sparta's obsession with physical perfection didn't prevent its decline, and Rome's familial control couldn't stop corruption from rotting its core. The infants they discarded might have been the very minds that could have saved them. History's darkest ironies aren't in the acts themselves, but in their futile attempts to cheat fate by playing God. The druid's knife glinted in the moonlight as he raised it above the bound prisoner. According to Roman historians like Pliny the Elder, this wasn't mere execution. It was high-stakes divination, a sacred act of reading the future in the steaming entrails of a living human. Celtic druids, the spiritual leaders of ancient Gaul and Britain, allegedly practiced a form of prophecy far more visceral than reading tea leaves or animal bones. The victims' last breaths were believed to carry messages from the gods, their convulsing organs acting as a supernatural map. Strabo wrote of druids slicing open sacrificial victims to observe the position of the limbs and the flow of blood, interpreting every spasm and twitch as omens of war, harvest, or plague. But the most infamous account comes from Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, where he describes the wicker man, a towering effigy woven from branches and filled with living prisoners, set ablaze as an offering to the gods. Caesar, never one to downplay barbarism when it suited his political agenda, claimed the Gauls believed these fiery sacrifices ensured fertility and victory. Modern archaeologists debate the accuracy of his descriptions. Only one potential wicker man sacrifice site has been tentatively identified in England, with charred remains found inside a large wooden enclosure. Yet the image persists, fueled by later Roman writers like Lucan, who painted druids as keepers of grotesque rites who fed the gods with blood. What's often overlooked is the complex context behind these acts. The Celts saw the human body as a microcosm of the universe, the liver representing the sky, the intestines mirroring rivers, the heart echoing the sacred world tree. To read, a person was to decipher divine will written in flesh. Some scholars argue these sacrifices weren't random acts of cruelty but carefully orchestrated rituals, possibly reserved for criminals or prisoners of war. Tacitus hints at this nuance, noting that Germanic tribes influenced by druidic traditions sometimes used those convicted of crimes for divination, blending justice with spirituality. The Romans had their own hypocrisies. While they condemned druidic sacrifices, they routinely butchered gladiators and staged mass executions in the arena. The key difference, spectacle versus sacrament. For the Celts, killing without spiritual purpose was unthinkable. For Rome, spirituality without political theater was wasted. This cultural clash reached its peak when Emperor Claudius outlawed Druidism in the 1st century, not just for its brutality but because its influence threatened Roman control. Suppressing the Druids wasn't merely about ending human sacrifice, it was about dismantling a rival power structure that could unite tribes against imperial rule. Today, the Wicker Man lives on in harvest festivals and horror films, stripped of its original context. But the Druids' legacy raises a provocative question. How much of their reputation was reality, and how much was Roman propaganda designed to justify conquest? The few surviving Celtic texts, like the Irish Book of Invasions, speak of sacrifices but focus more on poetic prophecy than gore. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the lines, in the ashes of fires long cold and the whispers of a people who left no written records of their own. One thing is certain, in the shadows of history, the line between holy rite and horror show has always been drawn by the victors. And sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones we'll never fully understand. The same hands that carefully harvested mistletoe with golden sickles, never letting it touch the ground, could also slit a man's throat to read his death throes. Druids saw no contradiction here to them. The natural world was both sanctuary and slaughterhouse, a place where life and death danced in sacred balance. Oaks, revered as portals to the divine, might bear witness to sacrifices beneath their branches. Sacred groves where herbs were gathered for healing also hosted altars stained with blood. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was a world view where violence and veneration were two sides of the same leaf. Modern scholars struggle to reconcile these extremes. On one hand, Druidic traditions showed deep ecological wisdom. They practiced sustainable forestry, worshipped rivers as goddesses, and marked time by the cycles of trees. The Coligny calendar, a 2,000-year-old Celtic artifact, tracks lunar and solar movements with precision rivaling Roman astronomy. Yet alongside this harmony ran rituals that would make even hardened warriors blanch. The bog bodies of northern Europe, preserved corpses like Lindo Man, reveal grotesque details, strangulation cords still embedded in necks, skulls crushed in triple deaths likely linked to Druidic rites. One theory suggests these victims were chosen as symbolic stand-ins for the gods, their suffering a cosmic offering to ensure fertile soil or military victory. Neo-pagans today grapple with this legacy. Groups like the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids emphasize the peaceful, nature-loving aspects of the tradition, holding rituals in forests and celebrating solstices with poetry rather than sacrifice. They argue Roman accounts exaggerated the violence to justify conquest. After all, Rome's own history is drenched in blood sports, but some archaeologists counter that evidence, like the Lindo man's injuries, can't be dismissed as propaganda. The truth likely lies in between. Druidic violence, when it occurred, wasn't senseless brutality but a sacred transaction, life given to sustain life. This duality mirrors tensions in other ancient faiths. The Aztecs wrote poetry comparing flowers to human hearts, even as they tore those hearts from living chests. Viking runes speak of meadows and mead, yet their sagas glory in battle. Perhaps what unsettles us isn't the violence itself, but its intimacy with beauty, the way a druid's knife might flash in the same moonlight that silvered the sacred oaks. Today's revival movements face a delicate task, honoring traditions without reviving their darkest edges. At Stonehenge, where modern druids gather for sunrise ceremonies, the only blood spilled is metaphorical. Yet the debate lingers. Can you truly reclaim a heritage by sanitizing it? Or does scrubbing away the shadows also dull the depth of what these beliefs once meant? The answer might lie in the druids' own teachings, that nothing in nature exists without its opposite, and even the gentlest spring blossom grows from soil fed by decay. The blade flashes downward, slicing through flesh with surgical precision, but this isn't an execution. It's a suicide performed with agonizing deliberation. Seppuku, the ritual stomach cutting of Japanese samurai, wasn't just death. It was theater, a final act where every movement carried centuries of meaning. The ceremony began with the condemned man dressed in white robes, the color of funeral shrouds. Kneeling on a woven mat, he'd select a short tanto dagger, its blade wrapped in paper to prevent his fingers from slipping in blood. With both hands gripping the hilt, he'd plunge it into his lower left abdomen, dragging it slowly rightward in a crosscut, then upward toward the sternum. The pain was unimaginable, yet showing any reaction would dishonor him. This was where the kaishakunin, his appointed second, played a crucial role. Standing behind with a razor-sharp katana, this trusted comrade had one grim duty: to decapitate the dying man the moment his resolve wavered. A perfect strike left a strip of flesh attaching the head to the body. Too clean a cut implied the victim lacked courage to complete seppuku. Historical accounts describe severed heads landing face up in the lap of the kneeling corpse, eyelids still fluttering as the brain's neurons fired their last. The kaishakunin's role was so vital that samurai would spend years mastering the technique, practicing on bamboo stands wrapped in straw to ensure they could sever a neck in one stroke. The symbolism ran deeper than mere suicide. The belly was considered the seat of the soul in Japanese culture. To expose one's intestines was to bare one's true intentions to the gods. By choosing this excruciating method, samurai proved their sincerity beyond doubt. Some even reached into their own wounds to toss entrails at witnesses, a final act of defiance. Women of the warrior class practiced a modified version called jigai, slicing their throats after binding their knees to maintain a dignified posture in death. The most legendary case unfolded in 18th century Edo, when 47 Ronin, masterless samurai, avenged their lord's unjust forced seppuku by slaughtering his enemy. Knowing rebellion meant death, they carried out their mission with military precision before surrendering. Their punishment, honorary seppuku, their graves at Sengakuji Temple still drawing pilgrims today. In a twist of dark irony, their enemy's son was ordered to act as their kaishakunin, decapitating the very men who'd killed his father. What chills isn't just the violence, but the meticulous choreography surrounding it. Poems were composed beforehand, last cups of sake shared, and ceremonial fans placed to catch the falling head. This was death as performance art, where agony became a brushstroke in a larger masterpiece of honor. Modern Japan outlawed seppuku in 1873, but its shadow lingers in 1970. Author Yukio Mishima staged a failed coup before committing seppuku on live television, his kaishakunin botching the decapitation with 3 clumsy strokes. Even in failure, the ritual's power endured, a stark reminder that some traditions cut too deep to vanish completely. Perhaps the most unsettling question isn't why they died this way, but why we're still captivated by it. There's a dark allure in the precision, the control, the transformation of suffering into something almost beautiful. In an age where suicide is rightly understood as tragedy, seppuku forces us to confront a worldview where death could be, under strict conditions, a form of exalted speech. The blade's edge, it seems, was never just steel. It was the line between horror and reverence, and the samurai walked it until their final breath. By the 20th century, the razor-sharp principles of Bushido had been reforged into something far more destructive, not a blade to be wielded with precision, but a weapon of mass sacrifice. The same code that once demanded samurai fall on their swords to preserve honor became the ideological fuel for the kamikaze pilots of World War II. Young men, some barely out of high school, strapped themselves into planes loaded with explosives, not as suicidal fanatics, but as heirs to a tradition that framed death as the ultimate act of loyalty. Their farewell letters echoed the poetry of seppuku centuries' earlier flowery words about cherry blossoms falling at their peak, comparing their impending deaths to petals scattering in the wind. The difference, where seppuku was personal atonement, kamikaze strikes were industrialized martyrdom, systematized by a wartime government that weaponized Bushido's deepest tenets. This wasn't organic cultural evolution, it was deliberate distortion. The original Bushido texts, like Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagakure, emphasized living with purpose, not just dying with honor. To rush into battle and be slain is easy, it cautioned, but true courage is in living when it is right to live. Yet by the 1940s, military propagandists cherry-picked passages about death, twisting them into mandates for wholesale sacrifice. Schools drilled children with slogans like "Die for the Emperor," while newspapers glorified pilots like Yukio Seki, who led the first official kamikaze unit. His final letter reveals the tension beneath the dogma. I am not doing this for the emperor or the empire. I am doing this because I was ordered to. The kamikaze phenomenon wasn't purely medieval tradition resurfacing. It was tradition hacked apart and welded onto modern machinery. Ancient samurai chose seppuku. Kamikaze pilots were often pressured by peer groups or threatened with disgrace. Archaeologists have uncovered bases where trainees were confined behind barbed wire, their letters home censored to remove any hesitation. Even the ritualistic elements were hollowed out, where a samurai seppuku involved meticulous preparation. Kamikaze sorties were rushed, chaotic affairs, with planes sometimes launching without proper fuel to reach targets. Yet the most disturbing legacy isn't in the past, it's in Japan's modern epidemic of karoshi, or death by overwork. The same culture that once valorized dying for one's lord now sees salarymen collapsing at their desks from exhaustion, their suits becoming the new funeral shrouds. In 2015, a 24-year-old advertising worker named Matsuri Takahashi jumped from her company dormitory after logging 105 hours of overtime in a month. Her suicide note read like a twisted echo of Bushido. I wish to die because I can't endure this anymore, but I mustn't die alone. I'll take the company with me. Her case forced Japan to legally recognize karoshi as a form of occupational hazard, yet the deaths continue. What connects these threads isn't just the act of dying, but the societal machinery that glorifies it. Samurai seppuku was meant to restore balance. Kamikaze strikes sought military advantage. Karoshi deaths stem from corporate greed. Yet all three wear the mask of duty. All three extract ultimate sacrifice under the guise of honor. The question isn't whether Bushido's legacy persists, but who benefits from its most corrosive interpretations. When a culture venerates endurance beyond reason, the line between devotion and exploitation blurs, and the bodies pile up, whether on ancient battlefields or in fluorescent-lit cubicles. Perhaps the most ironic twist is how Bushido's original ideals have been commercialized. Today, companies sell samurai leadership seminars, distilling centuries of complex philosophy into PowerPoint platitudes about loyalty and grit. The same ethos that once demanded critical thinking, questioning when to live, not just when to die, gets reduced to a branding exercise. Meanwhile, the real lessons gather dust. That true honor lies in balancing duty with self-worth, and that no ideology should demand a life as its price. The cherry blossoms still fall, but now they land on gravestones old and new, each one a silent witness to how easily reverence can become ruin. High in the thin air of the Andes, where the wind howls like restless spirits, a procession of children clad in fine tunics stumbled upward toward the snow. Their cheeks flushed with coca leaves and their minds clouded by chicha beer, these were no ordinary victims. They were the chosen ones. The Inca called it capacocha, the ultimate sacrifice, flawless children, selected for their beauty and purity, offered to the mountain gods in exchange for cosmic balance. Imagine a world where giving up your most precious treasure, your unblemished child, was seen not as cruelty, but as the highest honor a family could achieve. The ritual began with a search across the empire for physically perfect children, typically between 4 and 12 years old. Archaeologists examining frozen mummies note their elite status: smooth teeth with no signs of malnutrition, finely woven garments, even elaborate hairstyles preserved in ice. These weren't starving peasants, but the pampered offspring of nobles, raised for years in Cusco's temples before their final journey. Why? Because only the best could appease the Apus, the mountain deities who controlled weather, crops, and the fate of empires. The discovery of Juanita, the ice maiden of Mount Ampoto, brought this practice into heartbreaking focus. When volcanic ash melted her icy tomb in 1995, hikers found her seated cross-legged, her skin freeze-dried but intact, her expression eerily peaceful. Forensic analysis revealed her last hours, a blow to the head that likely rendered her unconscious before hypothermia set in. Nearby lay gold figurines, spondylus shells from distant coasts, and a half-finished tapestry, gifts meant to accompany her into the spirit world. But Juanita was just one of many. On Luleloko, the world's highest archaeological site at 22,000 feet, researchers found 3 more children in near-perfect condition. The Luleloko maiden still had coca wads in her mouth, her organs so well preserved that scientists could identify her final meal, a feast of maize and dried llama meat. Beside her, a younger boy showed traces of alcohol in his system, his face frozen in what some interpret as a smile. The most haunting was the 6-year-old lightning girl, whose body bore scorch marks from a post-mortem lightning strike, a sign later cultures took as divine approval. What unsettles modern minds isn't just the deaths, but their sacred intimacy. These children weren't slain brutally, but carefully guided toward eternal sleep, dressed in their finest, surrounded by treasures. Their mummies show no signs of struggle, only coca-dilated pupils and alcohol-slowed metabolisms. Some scholars believe parents accompanied them partway up the mountain, singing hymns before turning back, an act of faith as devastating as it was devout. The Incas saw these frozen tombs not as graves but bridges. By placing sacrifices on peaks straddling earth and sky, they created permanent ambassadors to the gods. Spanish chroniclers recorded padres destroying mummy bundles, horrified at how Andean villagers still left offerings at high-altitude shrines centuries after conquest. Even today, some Quechua communities whisper that disturbing these sleeping children brings storms or landslides, proof that in the thin air of the Andes, the line between history and belief remains as fragile as a child's frozen breath. Perhaps the hardest truth lies in the math. Researchers estimate hundreds of summits hold undiscovered mummies, meaning thousands may have died in these rituals over centuries. Yet Inca cosmology framed Capacocha not as loss but transformation, children becoming divine guardians, their frozen bodies literal pillars between worlds. In a civilization without written records, these ice-preserved time capsules speak volumes about power, about fear, and about the terrible price ancient peoples were willing to pay to keep their universe in order. Their voices, though silenced, still echo down the glaciers, whispers of love wrapped in sacrifice, preserved not just by cold, but by the unshakable conviction that some gifts, however painful, must be given. The same glaciers that swallowed these children whole are now surrendering them to science, but not without raising questions as sharp as the Andean winds. As climate change melts ice that has held for centuries, peaks like Ampoto and Lulaloco are giving up their frozen guardians, offering researchers an unprecedented window into the past. Juanita's stomach contents didn't just reveal her last meal, they preserved pollen grains and plant fibers that tell us what crops thrived in the 15th century. The lice clinging to the lightning girl's braids provide a genetic snapshot of ancient parasites, while ice cores drilled near these sites trap air bubbles from the Incas' heyday, literal breaths from a lost world. But the revelations come with ethical icefalls. When museums display these mummies behind glass, are they honoring history or staging a spectacle? The debate splits archaeologists and indigenous communities. Scientists argue that studying these bodies, like tracing coca residue in their teeth to map ancient trade routes, transforms them into ambassadors across time. Yet many Quechua descendants see it differently. In 2019, Bolivia's government repatriated 2 child mummies from Michigan's Museum of Natural History after activists argued their exhibition violated spiritual beliefs. These are not specimens, protested one Aymara leader. They are our ancestors frozen in prayer. The tension mirrors broader conflicts over human remains, from Egyptian mummies in British museums to Native American bones in university collections. But Inca ice mummies add a unique layer. Their near-perfect preservation makes them feel eerily alive. Juanita's lash-fringed eyelids and the Lulaloco boy's wind-chapped cheeks provoke reactions that skeletal remains rarely do. Some museums have adjusted accordingly. Argentina's mom keeps its mummies in darkened, climate-controlled cases visible only via timed lights, while others use holograms to show facial reconstructions instead of the actual bodies. Climate scientists face their own dilemma. Glaciers that conceal mummies also act as time capsules of environmental data. The same melt exposing children like Juanita threatens to destroy invaluable climate records before they can be studied. Researchers racing to document these sites compare it to salvaging books from a burning library, except the flames are corporate carbon emissions, and the books are children who never woke from their sacrificial sleep. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in the irony. These sacrifices were meant to stabilize a world the Incas believed hung in delicate balance. Now, as their melting tombs warn us of our own planetary imbalance, we must decide how to weigh respect for the dead against the urgent needs of the living. The Apus demanded precious gifts to maintain order centuries ago. Today, the mountains are giving back, but the gifts come with burdens we're still learning to carry. The temple doors swing open, revealing a dimly lit chamber thick with incense and murmurings. Inside, women draped in translucent fabrics lounge on embroidered cushions, their eyes lined with coal, not common courtesans, but holy figures, priestesses of Ishtar, the Mesopotamian goddess of love and war. To the modern observer, this might look like some ancient brothel, but in the world's first cities, these sacred prostitutes weren't selling pleasure. They were performing rituals believed to hold the cosmos itself together. Their bodies weren't just flesh, they were bridges between humanity and the divine, their acts of intimacy woven into the very fabric of fertility rites that determined the fate of crops, kingdoms, and futures. The practice centered on Ishtar, a deity as complex as she was powerful. Unlike later virgin goddesses, Ishtar reveled in sexuality, her myths brimming with lovers both divine and mortal. One epic describes her descent into the underworld, where each of her 7 gates strips away a layer of clothing symbolizing raw, untamed life force. Temples dedicated to her, like Babylon's famed Esagila, allegedly housed hierodules, women who engaged in ritual sex as part of worship. Greek historian Herodotus later wrote of a particularly striking custom. Every woman, no matter her status, was required to visit the temple once in her life and lie with a stranger, offering her earnings as tribute to the goddess. But here's where history gets murky. No cuneiform tablets explicitly detail temple prostitution as Herodotus described. Most references come from outsiders like the Greeks or later biblical writers, who had political motives to paint Mesopotamians as decadent. Modern scholars like Julia Asher-Grieve argue these women were likely priestesses who performed symbolic rituals, perhaps dances or sacred marriages rather than literal sex workers. Even the term sacred prostitute is a modern imposition. Mesopotamian texts call them nadatu or kadishtu, terms linked to devotion, not commercial exchange. Archaeological evidence adds further nuance. At excavators found tablets recording temple finances, lists of silver paid for wool, grain, and beer, but nothing directly tied to sexual services. Yet other finds, like terracotta plaques depicting couples entwined on beds, suggest fertility rituals had erotic components. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Acts we'd label as prostitution today may have held sacred significance then, blurred by time and translation. The most compelling counter-narrative comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. When the wild man in Kiddu is civilized by Shamhat, a temple woman, their week-long union isn't framed as transactional but transformative. Shamhat doesn't take payment, she teaches language, culture, and humanity. This mirrors how some Nadatu priestesses were literate, managing temple affairs and even adopting children, hardly the powerless figures later narratives suggest. Perhaps the real distortion isn't in the past, but in how we've projected modern morals onto it. Victorian archaeologists recoiled at the idea of sacred sex, dismissing it as pagan depravity. Today, some feminists reclaim these women as symbols of sexual agency. Both extremes miss the deeper truth. In a world where fertility meant survival, intimacy could be both practical and holy. The line between priestess and prostitute, between sacrament and sin, may say more about our own hang-ups than theirs. What lingers isn't just the question of what happened in those shadowed temple chambers, but why we're so obsessed with defining it. Maybe the most sacred thing about these women was their ability to defy categories, to stand at the crossroads of body and spirit, where even the act of questioning their role becomes its own kind of worship. Priestesses who wielded sacred power often walked a razor's edge, revered one moment, reviled the next. In Mesopotamia's temples, women like the Nadatu managed vast estates, drafted legal contracts, and even loaned silver at interest, their seals carrying the same authority as kings. Yet their independence came at a cost. Tablets from Sippar reveal how these unmarried priestesses faced suspicion. Their wealth made them targets for lawsuits from male relatives seeking control. One particularly bitter case involved a Nadatu accused of stealing her own inheritance, a charge that crumbled when she produced temple records proving her legitimate ownership. This duality defined their existence, spiritually exalted, yet perpetually battling societal constraints that framed their autonomy as unnatural. The Dividasis of ancient India carried similar contradictions. Dedicated as young girls to temples like Puri's Jagannath or Madurai's Meenakshi, these servants of the divine were trained in dance, music, and poetry, their performances considered essential for pleasing the gods. Inscriptions from the Chola dynasty describe Dividasis owning land, commissioning artworks, and even influencing royal succession, a far cry from the victim narrative later colonial accounts imposed. But as patriarchy tightened its grip, their sacred status warped. Medieval texts began labeling them as unchaste, and by the 19th century, British reformers, horrified by their mingling of spirituality and sexuality, lumped them in with common sex workers, stripping away centuries of reverence. The irony stings. Women once seen as living embodiments of Lakshmi's grace were now shunned as corrupting influences. Parallels between these traditions reveal a recurring historical pattern. Both priestesses and dividosis held economic independence, rare for their era's. Mesopotamian Nadatu traded in lapis lazuli and grain, while dividosis collected temple shares known as mirrors. Both systems blurred lines between worship and eroticism, with cuneiform hymns praising Ishtar's priestesses for opening the gates of ecstasy, and Tamil poetry extolling dividosis whose dances made the gods themselves yearn. Yet both also became lightning rods for societal anxieties about female autonomy. A Babylonian proverb warned, "A woman's temple is her ruin," while Hindu law books like the Manusmriti decreed that dividosis must never seek household comforts. Archaeology offers glimpses of resistance. At Ur, a Nadatu's grave was found with her personal cylinder seal still clasped in her hand, a defiant symbol of unbroken authority. In Tamil Nadu, 12th century temple carvings show dividosis towering over male patrons, their posture unapologetically commanding. These artifacts whisper of worlds where sacred femininity wasn't just tolerated but celebrated, until shifting power structures recast it as transgression. What truly unsettles isn't how these women fell from grace, but how their stories were rewritten to justify their marginalization. Victorian archaeologists labeled Mesopotamian priestesses as cult prostitutes, while colonial administrators recast dividosis as victims needing rescue. Both distortions served the same purpose, erasing female power by moralizing it into submission. The lesson echoes across millennia. When women hold both spiritual and economic sway, someone will always try to redraw the line between divinity and disgrace. Perhaps that's the most forbidden practice of all, the relentless rewriting of history to suit the prejudices of the present. The scream tore through the village square as the accused woman hit the water, her heavy skirts dragging her toward the bottom of the ducking stool. If she floated, it was proof of guilt, the water a pure element rejecting a witch. If she sank, innocence came at the cost of drowning. This was the swimming test, one of countless brutal ordeals inflicted during Europe's witch hunts, a frenzy that consumed tens of thousands between the 15th and 18th centuries. But behind the spectacle of burnings and trials lay something far darker, a systematic campaign that transformed ordinary women into scapegoats for every misfortune, from spoiled crops to sick livestock. At the heart of this hysteria sat the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a 15th century manual so venomous it became the blueprint for persecution. Written by German Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, this text didn't just describe witchcraft, it weaponized misogyny with chilling precision. Women were declared inherently weaker, more carnal than men, their insatiable lust supposedly making them easy prey for the devil. The book even provided a checklist for identifying witches, unusual marks on the skin which could be anything from birthmarks to scars, the ability to withstand torture without confessing proof of demonic endurance, or simply being poor, outspoken, or healing with herbs. The trials themselves were grotesque theater. In Bamberg, Germany, accused witches were forced to wear witch bridles, iron masks with spikes pressing into their tongues to prevent bewitching speech. Scottish courts used pricking, where witch-finders jabbed needles into supposed devil's marks, areas of numbskin. Since painless spots did exist, any lack of reaction was damning. Some victims endured sleepless nights while being walked in circles, their exhaustion taken as evidence of nocturnal dealings with Satan. But why women? The answer lies in a perfect storm of misogyny, religious fervor, and socioeconomic panic. Widows with property, healers with knowledge of herbs, midwives blamed for infant deaths. Any woman who defied societal norms risked accusation. In Salem, Massachusetts, the first 3 accused were an enslaved Caribbean woman, Tituba, a beggar, Sarah Good, and a sickly, outspoken widow, Sarah Osborne. Their trials exposed how easily fear could turn neighbor against neighbor, with spectral evidence, dreams and visions holding weight in court. The scale of the carnage staggers. In Trier, Germany, entire villages were left nearly womanless after mass executions. Switzerland's Protestant reformer John Calvin oversaw the burning of 34 witches in Geneva. Even children weren't spared in Wurzburg. A boy of 7 was burned alongside his mother. Estimates vary, but modern scholars suggest between 40 and 60,000 perished, 80% of them women. Yet the most haunting legacy isn't the body count, it's how ordinary people fueled the frenzy. Accusations often sprang from personal grudges, with witch-finders paid per conviction. Some victims under torture named others to escape the stake, creating chain reactions of paranoia. And when the fever finally broke, few perpetrators faced consequences. The same judges who sent hundreds to their deaths retired comfortably, their names forgotten while the screams of the condemned lingered in folklore. What makes the witch trials truly terrifying isn't their medieval barbarity, but their familiarity. The same mechanisms, demonization of the other, fake tests masquerading as justice, mass hysteria overriding reason, echo in modern witch hunts from McCarthyism to online mobs. The pyres may be gone, but the impulse to burn scapegoats remains, waiting for the next crisis to fan its flames. Perhaps the real witchcraft was making societies believe the enemy looked like anything but themselves. By the mid-20th century, something extraordinary happened. The very symbols that once condemned women to the stake became emblems of empowerment. In the quiet English countryside, a retired civil servant named Gerald Gardner began stitching together fragments of folklore, Masonic rituals, and his own imagination to birth modern Wicca. This wasn't a resurrection of medieval witchcraft, but a radical reinvention, one that transformed the witch's broom from a tool of satanic flight into a symbol of spiritual cleansing, the cauldron from a vessel of poison to one of healing. Gardner's Book of Shadows, the Wiccan Bible of sorts, deliberately reclaimed terms like coven and sabbat, draining them of their historical terror and refilling them with moonlit gatherings and seasonal celebrations. The contrasts between past and present are striking. Where inquisitors saw demonic pacts, Wiccans see sacred reciprocity, the threefold law, which holds that every action, good or bad, returns to the sender threefold. The pentagram, once branded a sign of the devil, became a protective talisman representing earth, air, fire, water, and spirit. Even the stereotypical witch's hat likely originated from medieval Jewish headwear or the pointed hoods of alewives, women who brewed beer, yet Wiccans wear it with pride at festivals, divorcing it from centuries of persecution. Pop culture, however, lags behind this evolution. Hollywood still peddles the green-skinned, cackling hag, think The Wizard of Oz's wicked witch or Snow White's poison-wielding queen. Modern hits like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina blend feminist themes with lingering satanic panic tropes, while The V-Witch romanticizes historical paranoia as horror. These portrayals create a bizarre duality. Real-life Wiccans host nature clean-ups and mental health circles, yet their cinematic counterparts remain stuck in the 17th century. The most telling backlash came in the 90s when conservative groups protested Wiccan soldiers' right to place pentagrams on military graves. The same symbol that adorned ancient Mesopotamian pottery and Pythagorean schools was suddenly anti-Christian, proving how deeply fear of witchcraft persists. Yet Wicca's growth is undeniable, from Gardner's first coven in the 1950s to an estimated 1.5 million practitioners today, with TikTok witches sharing crystal rituals and climate activists invoking Gaia. This revival raises provocative questions. Can a movement reclaim symbols without erasing their dark history? Should Wiccans distance themselves from the term witch to avoid stereotypes or embrace it as an act of defiance? The answers may lie in how the next generation chooses to wield these reclaimed tools, not as weapons of fear, but as bridges between past and present, between the fires that once consumed the accused and the candles now lit in their memory. The scent of roasting meat drifted through the palm trees as warriors gathered around the fire, but this was no ordinary feast. Among certain Polynesian societies, consuming the flesh of a fallen enemy wasn't an act of savagery. It was the ultimate spiritual transaction, a way to absorb their mana, the life force that flowed through all living things. European explorers like Captain James Cook returned with lurid tales of cannibal isles, but the truth behind these rituals was far more complex than their horrified accounts suggested. Take the fate of Cook's crew at Kealakekua Bay in 1779. When a skirmish broke out over a stolen boat, Hawaiian warriors killed Cook and several sailors. According to British accounts, their bodies were ceremonially prepared, the flesh removed, bones cleaned and distributed among chiefs. This wasn't mindless butchery but part of the ha'aina mole, the meal of reconciliation, where consuming powerful foes redistributed their sacred energy. Cook, revered as the god Lono, became literal nourishment for the society he'd unknowingly embodied. Archaeology confirms selective ritual cannibalism across Polynesia, but often contradicts European exaggerations. On the Marquesas Islands, excavations reveal human bones with cut marks consistent with defleshing. Yet these remains represent less than 1% of burials, suggesting it was rare and reserved for exceptional circumstances. The Maori of New Zealand practiced what they called utu, consuming slivers of a warrior's heart to transfer his courage. Fijian chiefs ate enemies' eyes to gain strategic insight, believing the organ held a warrior's tactical wisdom. What outsiders misinterpreted as bloodlust was actually a sophisticated cosmology. Polynesians saw the universe as a closed energy system. Mana couldn't be created, only recycled. Eating a respected foe prevented their power from being lost, like passing a torch rather than extinguishing it. This explains why commoners were rarely consumed. Their mana wasn't worth harvesting. There was even a protocol. High-ranking victims were cooked in special earth ovens separate from food, their bones preserved as talismans rather than discarded like animal remains. The gulf between perception and reality widens when examining missionary records. Early ministers described cannibal forks, used to avoid touching sacred human flesh. Tools later revealed to be purely ceremonial, never actually used in meals. Similarly, European drawings of mass feasts often copied each other's fantasies rather than documenting real events. Modern anthropologists now believe most Polynesian societies practiced ritual tasting rather than full consumption, with symbolic bites carrying more importance than gluttony. Yet the darkest irony lies in how these stories were weaponized. Colonizers used cannibalism narratives to justify brutal, civilizing campaigns, even as European battlefields piled corpses higher than any island midden. The same societies that shuddered at Polynesian rituals had no qualms about displaying indigenous skulls in museums or boiling down Maori heads for European collectors. The real consumption wasn't of flesh, it was of cultures, swallowed whole by empires hungry for land and resources. Today, contemporary Polynesians grapple with this loaded legacy. Some activists reclaim the term cannibal as rebellion against colonial shaming, while scholars emphasize how these practices differed starkly from survival cannibalism seen in desperate situations like the Donner Party. The mana concept itself survives not in flesh, but in modern Hawaiian sovereignty movements that seek to reclaim spiritual and political power. Perhaps that's the final twist. The very forces that demonized these rituals failed to recognize their own hunger for domination, a craving far more insatiable than any ceremonial bite could satisfy. Colonial ships returned from the Pacific weighed down with more than spices and artifacts. They carried tales so lurid, so shocking, they shaped Europe's view of these islands for centuries. But how much of what sailors like Captain Cook's crew reported was observation, and how much was deliberate distortion? The very word cannibal comes from the Spanish cannibal, a corruption of Carib, the indigenous people Columbus demonized to justify enslaving them. This pattern of exaggeration wasn't accidental. It was political theater, a way to paint Pacific cultures as irredeemably savage in need of civilizing intervention. Take Fiji, where European accounts described chiefs feasting on piles of bodies. While ritual cannibalism did exist, archaeology confirms bones with cut marks in ceremonial sites. The scale was wildly inflated. Methodist missionaries claimed the legendary chief Rotu Udda Udda consumed over 800 victims, a number that strains credulity when analyzing Fiji's pre-contact population. Modern scholars like anthropologist Paul Gerati suggest these numbers served a purpose, justifying land seizures and conversion campaigns. After all, how could anyone object to stopping such monstrous practices? The distortions went beyond numbers. European illustrators depicted Fijians with exaggerated features, thick lips, wild eyes, often copying each other's sketches rather than drawing from life. One infamous engraving showed a Fijian woman casually gnawing a human hand like an apple, a scene no first-hand account supports. These images circulated in newspapers and museums, hardening stereotypes that made colonial violence seem righteous. Yet the most damning evidence against these exaggerations comes from Fiji itself. Oral histories recorded in the 19th century describe cannibalism as rare and spiritually charged, reserved for vanquished warriors of high status, their flesh eaten not out of hunger but to harness their mana. The heart might be consumed by a priest, the eyes by a strategist, each act a transfer of specific powers. Contrast this with the European portrayal of mindless gluttony, and the agenda becomes clear: dehumanization sells conquest. In a twist of historical irony, Fiji is now reclaiming this narrative. Recent reconciliation ceremonies like the 2003 Riguragu apology saw descendants of cannibal chiefs formally ask forgiveness from tribes their ancestors consumed. But these aren't admissions of European caricatures, they're nuanced reckonings with a complex past. Participants emphasize context. Cannibalism emerged during centuries of intertribal warfare, sometimes as a substitute for slavery. The ceremonies don't erase history, they reframe it, stripping away colonial hyperbole to reveal traditions that were brutal but never senseless. The lesson here isn't that cannibalism didn't happen, it's that its story was hijacked. Just as Spanish conquistadors weaponized Aztec sacrifices to justify razing Tenochtitlan, colonial powers inflated Pacific practices to mask their own greed. The real savagery wasn't in the earth ovens of Fiji, it was in the ledgers of empire where human lives were tallied as profit or loss, and that's a feast of hypocrisy we're still digesting today. From the blood-soaked altars of the Aztecs to the glacial tombs of Inca children, we've walked through history's most unsettling corridors, places where the unthinkable was once routine. These weren't fringe acts committed in shadows, but celebrated traditions embedded in laws, glorified in art, and sanctified by gods. The Aztec priest who carved out a living heart believed he was holding the sun in place. The Spartan elder who discarded a flawed infant saw himself as strengthening the state. The European witch hunter, torch in hand, genuinely thought he was saving souls. What unites these horrors isn't just their brutality, but their terrifying banality, the way ordinary people, convinced of their own righteousness, could render cruelty sacred with nothing more than consensus and time. Consider the arc of these practices. Human sacrifice, once the bedrock of empires, now lives only in museums and nightmares. Gladiatorial games, the ancient world's premier entertainment, would trigger global outrage today. Foot binding, a marker of elite femininity for centuries, is now a cautionary tale of mutilation disguised as beauty. The shift wasn't inevitable, It took seismic changes in power, philosophy, and empathy to redraw the line between devotion and depravity. Yet history's greatest illusion may be the belief that we've reached the end point of moral progress, that our modern sensibilities are the finished product, rather than another layer in an unfinished tapestry. So here's the chilling question: which of our rituals will future generations recoil from? The factory farming that treats sentient creatures as raw materials, the algorithmic surveillance that trades privacy for convenience, the casual destruction of ecosystems in the name of growth. These aren't hypotheticals, they're practices we defend with the same fervor that Spartans invoked for infanticide or Victorians used to justify child labor. The most insidious atrocities aren't the ones we recognize as evil, but the ones we've convinced ourselves are necessary, even noble. As the screen fades to a time lapse of an ancient temple crumbling into vines, remember this: every society believes its moral compass points true north, until history proves it was magnetized by blind spots all along. The real horror isn't how easily humanity embraces darkness, but how confidently we mistake it for light. So tell us in the comments, what modern traditions will our descendants view with the same horrified fascination we reserve for the Blood Eagle or the Wicker Man? And if you dare to keep confronting history's forbidden truths, subscribe now, because the past never really vanishes. It just waits for the right moment to whisper its warnings again.